The merciless Arizona sun beat down on Copper Ridge like a blacksmith's hammer on red-hot iron. Jake Morrison pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face, the brim casting a shadow that couldn't quite hide the lines etched by 30 years of frontier life. The drought had been relentless for 3 months now, turning the once green pastures into a cracked wasteland that stretched endlessly toward the purple mountains on the horizon. Jake's boots kicked up small clouds of dust as he walked down Main Street, the wooden planks of the sidewalk creaking under his weight. The town felt different today. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. Copper Ridge had always been a place where different worlds collided. Ranchers and miners, settlers and drifters, and the Apache who had called this land home long before any white man had ever set foot here. The sound of angry voices drifted from the direction of the sheriff's office, growing louder with each step Jake took. A crowd had gathered, their faces flushed with heat and something darker. Jake recognized most of them. Tom Bradley, the banker whose soft hands had never known a day of real work. Pete Hutchinson, who owned the largest ranch in the county, and at least 24 other men whose desperation had been growing with each passing day without rain. "String him up," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "We don't need no trial for a thieving Apache." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors circulating since dawn about cattle disappearing from the Hutchinson ranch, and apparently someone had been quick to point fingers. In times like these, when the land was dying and tempers ran as hot as the desert wind, it was always easier to blame the outsider, the different one. Pushing through the crowd, Jake caught sight of the young Apache man at the center of the commotion. He couldn't have been more than 25, with long black hair and eyes that held no fear, only a quiet dignity that reminded Jake of his own father. The young man's hands were bound behind his back, and Sheriff Coleman stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd's demands grew more violent. "Now hold on, boys," Sheriff Coleman said, his voice strained. "We need to follow proper procedure here. There'll be a trial." "Trial?" Tom Bradley spat, his face red with indignation. "What trial? We all know what happened. Hutchinson's cattle are gone, and this savage was seen near the pasture. That's all the evidence we need." Jake felt his blood begin to boil. He'd seen enough frontier justice in his lifetime to know that it was rarely about justice at all. It was about fear, about anger, about the need to blame someone, anyone, for the hardships that seemed to multiply with each passing day. The young Apache man's name was Ayanna, Jake learned from the whispered conversations around him. He was the son of a respected elder from the nearby reservation, known for his skill with horses and his peaceful nature. But none of that mattered to the mob that was rapidly forming around him. "Get the rope," Pete Hutchinson commanded, his voice cutting through the desert air like a whip crack. "We're done waiting for justice that ain't coming." Jake watched as several men moved toward the old oak tree that stood in the center of town square, its gnarled branches offering the only shade for miles around. The same tree where children played in cooler times, where couples had carved their initials, where the town held its rare celebrations. It was about to become a symbol of something far darker. The crowd surged forward, and Jake saw the moment when civilized men became something else entirely. Their faces were twisted with a primal hunger that he recognized from his days as a cavalry scout, the same look he'd seen in the eyes of soldiers who'd been too long in the wilderness, too long without hope. Sheriff Coleman made a half-hearted attempt to maintain order, but Jake could see the man was outnumbered and outgunned. The badge on his chest might as well have been made of paper for all the authority it carried in this moment. "This ain't right," Jake muttered to himself, his hand instinctively moving to the worn grip of his Colt 45. But he knew that drawing his weapon would only escalate the situation, potentially turning a lynching into a massacre. Ayanna was being dragged toward the tree now, his feet carving furrows in the dust. His dark eyes swept the crowd, not searching for help. Jake could see the young man had no expectation of finding any, but taking in the faces of those who would be his executioners. There was something heartbreaking in that gaze, a resignation that spoke of a people who had learned that justice was not meant for them. The rope was already being prepared, its rough hemp fibers catching the afternoon light. Jake had seen enough hangings to know that this one would be quick and brutal, more about vengeance than justice. The young Apache would die not because he was guilty, but because he was convenient. "Wait," Jake heard himself call out, his voice carrying over the crowd's angry murmur. "You men are about to make a mistake you can't take back." The crowd turned toward him, and Jake felt the weight of their collective stare. He'd been in Copper Ridge for 5 years now, long enough to be considered a local, but not long enough to have the kind of influence that could stop what was about to happen. Still, he had to try. "What's it to you, Morrison?" Pete Hutchinson snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns every man here," Jake replied, stepping closer to the circle that had formed around Ayanna. "Because once we start hanging people without proof, without trial, we stop being the civilized folk we claim to be." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the scene, and Jake could see the dust devils dancing in the distance, little tornadoes of earth and air that seemed to mirror the chaos building in the town square. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As Jake looked into the eyes of the young Apache warrior, he saw something that made his decision for him. It wasn't fear he saw there, but a quiet strength that reminded him of his own son, lost to fever 3 winters ago. In that moment, Jake Morrison knew that he couldn't stand by and watch another young man die, especially not like this. The rope was ready now, its noose casting a sinister shadow on the ground. The crowd pressed closer, their bloodlust palpable in the stifling heat. Sheriff Coleman had given up any pretense of maintaining order, stepping back to let the mob have their way. Jake took a deep breath, tasting the dust and desperation that filled the air. Whatever happened next, he knew there would be no going back. The choices made in the next few moments would echo through the canyons and mesas of Arizona territory for years to come. The sun continued its relentless assault on the land, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead, its cry a lonely sound in the vast emptiness of the desert. But in the town square of Copper Ridge, surrounded by angry men and bitter heat, Jake Morrison prepared to make the stand that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone in this forgotten corner of the frontier. The hemp rope swayed slightly in the hot desert breeze, its shadow dancing across the packed earth like a serpent preparing to strike. Jake Morrison felt the weight of every eye in the crowd as he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the sun-baked ground. The silence that followed his words seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the distant whistle of wind through the canyon walls. "Step aside, Morrison," Pete Hutchinson growled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "This is ranch business, and you ain't got no say in it." Jake's weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but his muscles were coiled tight as a spring. He'd been in enough tight spots to know that the next few seconds would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. But as he looked at the young Apache man, Ayanna, he saw something that made his choice clear. The warrior's eyes held no plea for help, no desperate hope for rescue. Instead, there was only acceptance and a dignity that these men were trying to strip away along with his life. "Maybe I don't have a say in your ranch business," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "But I got a say in what happens in my town, and I ain't about to let you boys murder an innocent man." "Innocent?" Tom Bradley spat, his banker's vest straining against his considerable belly. "The cattle are gone, Morrison. That's all the proof we need." Jake slowly turned to face the crowd, his movements deliberate and calm despite the tension crackling in the air like heat lightning. "Proof? You mean the word of a man who's already decided this Apache is guilty? That ain't proof, Bradley. That's just fear, dressed up as justice." The crowd shifted restlessly, some of the men looking uncertain for the first time. Jake could see doubt creeping into their faces, the kind of doubt that came when someone forced you to look at what you were really doing. But Pete Hutchinson wasn't having any of it. "You calling me a liar, Morrison?" Hutchinson's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. "I'm calling you a man who's letting his anger cloud his judgment," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off the rancher. "Same as all of you. The drought's got everyone spooked, and now that some cattle are missing, you need someone to blame. But hanging the first Apache you can get your hands on ain't going to bring back your livestock." Sheriff Coleman chose that moment to find his voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Jake's right, boys, we should wait for the circuit judge. The circuit judge ain't coming for 3 weeks, someone shouted from the back. "You want us to feed and house this savage for 3 weeks while our cattle keep disappearing?" Jake felt the mood of the crowd shifting, the momentary doubt being replaced by renewed anger. He knew he was running out of time, and words alone weren't going to be enough to save Ayanna's life. Sometimes, a man had to be willing to put his body where his principles were. Without another word, Jake walked over to where Ayanna stood, his hands still bound behind his back. The young Apache watched him approach with those steady dark eyes, and Jake could see the question there. Why would a white man risk his life for a stranger, especially one from a people that many considered enemies? Jake positioned himself directly between Ayanna and the crowd, his broad shoulders blocking their view of the condemned man. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The cowboy had literally placed himself between the Apache and the Noose. "You want to hang him," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of facing down dangerous men in dangerous places. "You'll have to go through me first." The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but Jake noticed that none of them moved closer. They were brave enough when facing an unarmed Apache, but confronting a man with Jake's reputation was a different matter entirely. Jake Morrison had been a cavalry scout, a trail boss and a lawman before settling in Copper Ridge. Men who knew him understood that he didn't make idle threats. "You're making a mistake, Morrison," Pete Hutchinson said, his hand now gripping his pistol openly. "A big mistake." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, "but it's my mistake to make, and I'd rather make the mistake of standing up for what's right than live with the mistake of letting an innocent man hang." Behind him, Jake could hear Ayanna's quiet breathing, steady and calm despite the circumstances. The young Apache hadn't said a word since being dragged to the tree, but Jake could feel his presence like a weight against his back. Whatever happened next, Jake knew he wouldn't be facing it alone. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the dust-covered landscape. The shadows were growing longer, and Jake could see the first bats beginning to emerge from their roosts in the canyon walls. Time was running out, and everyone in the square knew it. "Last chance, Morrison," Hutchinson warned, drawing his pistol halfway from its holster. "Step aside or we'll go through you." Jake's hand moved to his own weapon, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. Instead, he looked around the crowd, meeting the eyes of men he'd shared drinks with, men whose children he'd helped when they were lost, men who'd called him friend just that morning. "Look around you, boys," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of sadness that cut through the anger. "Look at what we're about to do. We're about to hang a man based on nothing more than suspicion and fear. Is that the kind of town you want Copper Ridge to be? Is that the kind of men you want to be?" For a moment, the crowd wavered. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, the conflict between their fear and their conscience. But then Pete Hutchinson raised his voice again and the moment was lost. "Pretty words, Morrison, but they don't change facts. This Apache is guilty and he's going to hang. The only question is whether you're going to hang beside him." Jake slowly turned back to face Ayanna, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he spoke directly to the young Apache. "What's your name, son?" "Ayanna," the young man replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "It means eternal blossom." Jake nodded, as if the name explained everything. "Well, Ayanna, it looks like we're in for a fight. You ready for that?" The Apache's lips curved in the slightest hint of a smile. "I have been ready since I drew my first breath, cowboy. The question is, are you ready to die for a man you do not know?" "I've been ready to die for 30 years, Jake replied. "But I ain't planning on dying today. Not if I can help it." The crowd was growing restless again, and Jake could see that his time for talk was over. Men were checking their weapons, loosening their gun belts, preparing for the violence that seemed inevitable. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. Jake drew his Colt .45 in one smooth motion, the worn grip fitting his hand like it had been crafted specifically for him. The sound of the weapon clearing leather caused the crowd to take a collective step back, but Jake didn't point it at anyone. Instead, he held it at his side, ready but not threatening. "I've got 6 shots, he announced calmly. "First man who tries to put that rope around this boy's neck gets one of them. Second man gets another. And so on. Now I know there's more than 6 of you, but I guarantee you that 6 of you won't be going home to your families tonight if you press this." The standoff stretched out like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. Jake could feel sweat running down his back, not from the heat, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Behind him, Ayanna stood perfectly still, but Jake could sense the young man's readiness to fight if given the chance. The sun touched the horizon, painting the entire scene in blood-red light. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing off the canyon walls. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the crowd frozen. and Jake saw Pete Hutchinson's gun, clear leather. "So be it," Hutchinson snarled, raising his weapon toward Jake. But before he could fire, another voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. It was Sheriff Coleman, and his words would change everything. "Hold it right there, Pete. All of you. Hold it right there." Sheriff Coleman's voice carried an authority that Jake hadn't heard from the man in years. The lawman stepped forward, his hand resting on his own weapon, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he looked like he remembered what that badge on his chest actually meant. "What are you doing, Coleman?" Pete Hutchinson demanded, his gun still trained on Jake. "This is no time to grow a backbone." "This is exactly the time," Coleman replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Because I just remembered something that changes everything." Jake kept his weapon ready, but he could sense a shift in the crowd's mood. The sheriff's words had created a moment of uncertainty, and Jake had learned long ago that uncertainty could be more powerful than any gun. "Well?" Tom Bradley called out impatiently. "What is it, Sheriff?" Coleman walked over to where Ayanna stood, studying the young Apache's face carefully. The lawman's weathered features showed the strain of a man wrestling with his conscience, but there was something else there too, recognition. "This boy didn't steal your cattle, Pete," Coleman said quietly, "because 3 days ago he was here in town warning me about a group of rustlers he'd seen heading toward your ranch." The crowd fell silent, the only sound the whisper of wind through the mesquite brush. Jake felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly, but he kept his gun ready. He'd seen mobs turn on a dime before, and he wasn't about to let his guard down now. "That's impossible," Hutchinson sputtered. "Why would an Apache warn us about rustlers?" "Because," Coleman continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "his father asked him to. Chief Nalnish sent his son to warn us because the rustlers were planning to make it look like Apache work. They wanted to stir up trouble between the town and the reservation." Jake glanced back at Ayanna, who nodded slightly. The young Apache's expression hadn't changed, but Jake could see something in his eyes. Not relief exactly, but a quiet satisfaction that the truth was finally being told. "You're lying," Pete Hutchinson accused, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Even if that's true, it doesn't prove he didn't steal my cattle." "Actually, it does," Coleman replied, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn from handling. "Because I wrote it all down. Date, time, everything Ayanna told me about the rustlers, and according to my notes, your cattle were stolen the same day he was here talking to me." Jake watched as the crowd processed this information, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. These were men who'd been ready to commit murder based on nothing more than assumption and prejudice, and now they were being forced to confront the ugliness of their actions. "Even if that's true," Bradley said, his voice defensive, "we still don't know who took the cattle. This Apache story could be just that, a story." "No," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, "it ain't no story." Everyone turned to see Jimmy Martinez, a young ranch hand who worked for one of the smaller spreads outside of town. His face was flushed with excitement and fear, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "I seen them," Jimmy continued, pushing through the crowd. "The rustlers, they're holed up in Devil's Canyon about 10 miles north of here. I was tracking strays when I spotted their camp. They got at least 50 head of cattle with them, all wearing Pete's brand." Jake felt the last of the tension drain from his body, but he kept his gun ready. Mobs were dangerous even when they were wrong, and sometimes especially when they were wrong. "How many of them?" Jake asked, his tactical mind already working on the problem. 4, maybe 5, Jimmy replied. "They're well armed and they've got a good defensive position. Won't be easy to root them out." Pete Hutchinson slowly lowered his gun, his face showing a mixture of shame and anger. "If this is true, if we almost hanged an innocent man," Jake finished for him. "Yeah, Pete, you almost did. All of you almost did." The crowd began to disperse, the men avoiding eye contact with each other and with Jake. They knew they'd come within minutes of committing an act that would have haunted them for the rest of their lives, and the knowledge sat heavy on their shoulders. Jake holstered his weapon and turned to face Ayanna, who stood watching the proceedings with that same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. The young Apache's hands were still bound, and Jake moved to free him. "I'm sorry," Jake said as he worked at the ropes. "I'm sorry for what nearly happened here." Ayanna flexed his hands as the bonds fell away, working feeling back into his fingers. "You have nothing to apologize for, Cowboy. You stood between me and the darkness. That is not a small thing." "Jake Morrison," Jake said, extending his hand. "And you're right, it ain't a small thing, but it's what any decent man would do." Ayanna clasped Jake's hand, and Jake was surprised by the strength in the young Apache's grip. "I am honored to know you, Jake Morrison. My father will want to meet the man who risked his life for his son." Sheriff Coleman approached them, his face showing the strain of the last hour. "Ayanna, I owe you an apology. I should have spoken up sooner, should have reminded these men about your warning. I let fear make me forget my duty." "Fear makes cowards of us all, Sheriff," Ayanna replied. "But courage can make heroes of even the most frightened man. You found your courage when it mattered most." Jake looked around the nearly empty square, noting how quickly the crowd had melted away once the truth came out. Only a handful of men remained, and most of them were looking anywhere but at the three men standing beneath the oak tree. "What now?" Jake asked. "Those rustlers are still out there, and they're not going to give up easy." "Now we do what we should have done from the beginning," Coleman said, straightening his shoulders. "We form a proper posse and go after the real criminals." "I'll ride with you," Jake said immediately. "After what nearly happened here, I figure I owe it to Ayanna to help catch the men who caused this mess." "And I will ride with you as well," Ayanna added, causing both men to look at him in surprise. "Son," Jake said carefully, "you don't owe us anything. Hell, after what we almost did to you, you'd be within your rights to head back to the reservation and never set foot in this town again." Ayanna smiled, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the expression reached his eyes. "Justice is not about debts, Jake Morrison. It is about doing what is right. Those men not only stole cattle, they tried to use my people as a shield for their crimes. That cannot stand." The sun had set while they talked, painting the sky in deep purples and blues that seemed to stretch forever across the desert landscape. The first stars were beginning to appear, and Jake could hear the night sounds of the desert beginning to stir. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. "We'll ride at first light," Coleman decided. "Give me tonight to round up some good men who won't lose their heads when things get tough." Jake nodded, then looked at Ayanna. "Where will you spend the night? The hotel might not be too welcoming after what happened here." "I will camp outside of town," Ayanna replied, "under the stars, where a man can think clearly and prepare his spirit for what tomorrow may bring." "You're welcome to stay at my place," Jake offered. "I've got a spare room, and after today I'd be honored to have you as a guest." Ayanna considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I accept your offer, Jake Morrison. But first, I must send word to my father. He will be worried when I do not return tonight." "How will you get word to him?" Coleman asked. Ayanna smiled mysteriously. "The desert has many ways of carrying messages, Sheriff. My father will know that I am safe and that justice is being served." As the three men walked away from the oak tree, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the events of this day had set something in motion that would reach far beyond the simple matter of stolen cattle. He'd made a choice to stand up for what was right, and that choice had created ripples that would spread out across the desert like waves on a pond. Behind them, the rope still hung from the oak tree, swaying gently in the night breeze. But it was empty now, and Jake hoped it would remain that way. The town of Copper Ridge had come dangerously close to losing its soul today, and Jake knew that some sins left scars that never fully healed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to do what was right. But tonight, Jake Morrison would sleep with a clear conscience, knowing that he'd stood up when it mattered most. And beside him, a young Apache warrior would rest easy as well, knowing that not all white men were his enemies. The desert night settled over Copper Ridge like a blanket, and in the distance a single drumbeat began to echo across the canyons, a sound that seemed to carry promises of changes yet to come. The first light of dawn painted the eastern mountains in shades of gold and amber, and Jake Morrison was already awake, sipping coffee from a tin cup as he watched the sun rise over the desert. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams filled with the angry faces of the mob and the quiet dignity of the young Apache he'd saved. Beside him, Ayanna sat in comfortable silence, his own eyes fixed on the horizon. "Your father got your message," Jake observed, noting the way Ayanna's posture had subtly changed during the night. There was an expectancy about him, as if he were waiting for something. "Yes," Ayana replied simply. "He knows what happened yesterday, and he knows what will happen today." Jake was about to ask what that meant when the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Sheriff Coleman rode up with a posse of 8 men, all of them armed and ready for trouble. Jake recognized most of them, good men who'd had no part in yesterday's near lynching. "You boys ready to ride?" Coleman asked, his face grim but determined. "Ready as we'll ever be," Jake replied, swinging up into his saddle. Ayana mounted a paint horse that Jake hadn't seen before, the animal appearing as if by magic during the night. The ride to Devil's Canyon took them through some of the most unforgiving country in Arizona territory. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by towering rock formations and deep arroyos that could hide a dozen men. Jake had ridden this country before, but never with the weight of yesterday's events pressing down on him. As they rode, Jake found himself thinking about the choice he'd made. Standing up for Ayana had been the right thing to do, but it had also changed something fundamental in Copper Ridge. The town had been forced to confront its own capacity for evil, and that was a reckoning that would echo for years to come. They reached the rim of Devil's Canyon just as the sun hit its zenith, the desert heat already becoming oppressive. Below them, Jake could see the Rustlers' camp, a collection of rough shelters built into the canyon walls, with a rope corral holding the stolen cattle. "There," Jimmy Martinez pointed. "Just like I said. 4 men, maybe 5, and they're all armed." Jake studied the camp through his spyglass, noting the positions of the guards and the layout of the site. It would be a tough fight, but they had surprise on their side. "We go in fast and hard," Coleman decided. "No unnecessary killing, but we can't let them get away either." The battle was brief but intense. The Rustlers, caught off guard by the sudden attack, put up a fierce fight before finally surrendering. 2 of them were wounded, but none killed, a result that Jake was grateful for. There had been enough violence in his life already. As they rounded up the prisoners and recovered the stolen cattle, Jake noticed that Ayana had remained unusually quiet throughout the entire operation. The young Apache had fought with skill and courage, but there was something in his manner that suggested he was thinking about more than just the immediate situation. "What is it?" Jake asked as they prepared to head back to town. Ayana looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "Nothing that concerns you, my friend, but I think you will understand soon enough." The journey back to Copper Ridge took most of the afternoon, the recovered cattle slowing their progress. Jake found himself riding beside Ayana, and the 2 men talked about everything and nothing. The weather, the land, the changes that were coming to the territory. It was the kind of conversation that men have when they've shared danger and come out the other side alive. As they crested the final hill before town, Jake pulled up short. Below them, Copper Ridge looked different somehow, though he couldn't immediately put his finger on why. The buildings were the same, the streets were the same, but something had changed. And then he saw them. They lined both sides of the main street, standing as still as statues in the afternoon heat. Apache warriors, hundreds of them, all mounted on horses and all facing the road that led into town. They weren't threatening, their weapons were sheathed, their postures relaxed, but their presence was unmistakable. "Jesus," Sheriff Coleman breathed. "There must be 500 of them." Jake looked at Ayana, who was smiling for the first time since Jake had met him. "Your father's message," Jake said, understanding flooding through him. "Word travels fast in the desert," Ayana replied. "By dawn, every Apache within 100 miles knew what you had done. They came to see the white man who stood between one of their sons and the rope." As the posse rode slowly down the main street, Jake became aware of the profound silence that had settled over the town. The Apache warriors watched them pass, their faces impassive but their eyes missing nothing. There was no hostility in their gaze, but there was something else, a recognition perhaps, or a judgment being passed. The townspeople had come out to watch as well, lining the sidewalks and peering from windows. Jake could see the fear in their faces, the uncertainty about what this massive gathering meant. Some of them were the same men who'd been ready to lynch Ayana just 24 hours earlier. At the center of the Apache formation, Jake spotted an older warrior whose bearing marked him as a chief. He sat his horse with the kind of dignity that came from a lifetime of leadership, and when his eyes met Jake's, the cowboy felt as if he were being measured by some ancient standard. "That's my father," Ayana said quietly. "Chief Nalnish. He wishes to speak with you." Jake dismounted and walked over to where the chief waited. The old Apache's face was weathered by decades of sun and wind. but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd led his people through times of war and peace. "I am Nalnish," he said in accented but clear English. "You are the one called Jake Morrison." "Yes, sir," Jake replied, removing his hat. "I'm honored to meet you." The chief studied him for a long moment, and Jake felt as if the old man were looking directly into his soul. "My son tells me you risked your life to save his. In our culture, such an act creates bonds that cannot be broken." "I did what any decent man would do," Jake said, uncomfortable with the praise. "No," Nalnish replied firmly. "You did what few men would do. You stood alone against many with nothing but your principles to guide you. That is the mark of a true warrior." The chief raised his hand, and the massive gathering of Apache warriors began to move. But instead of dispersing, they formed a corridor along the main street, creating a path of honor for Jake and the posse to walk through. "This is for you, Jake Morrison," Nalnish said, "so that all who see will know that you are a friend to the Apache people. Your courage has built a bridge between our peoples that will endure long after we are both gone." Jake felt tears prick his eyes as he understood the magnitude of what was happening. These warriors had ridden from across the territory, not to wage war or exact revenge, but to honor a single act of decency. In a world where violence and hatred seemed to rule, this was a reminder that honor and courage could still make a difference. As Jake walked through the corridor of warriors, he felt the weight of their respect and the responsibility that came with it. He'd made a choice to stand up for what was right, and that choice had created something beautiful and lasting. The Apache warriors began to disperse as the sun sank toward the western horizon, melting away into the desert as silently as they had come. But their message had been delivered, and Jake knew that the people of Copper Ridge would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Ayana approached Jake as the last of the warriors disappeared into the gathering dusk. "My father wishes me to tell you that you will always be welcome in our villages, and that your name will be spoken with honor around our fires." Jake clasped the young Apache's hand, feeling the weight of friendship and mutual respect. "Thank you, Ayana, for everything. Thank you, Jake Morrison, for showing us that not all white men have forgotten what honor means." As night fell over Copper Ridge, Jake stood in the town square beneath the old oak tree. The rope was gone now, cut down and burned, and Jake hoped it would never be replaced. The town had learned something important about itself in the last 2 days, both its capacity for evil and its potential for redemption. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to do what was right. But tonight, Jake Morrison could rest easy, knowing that he'd helped build a bridge between two peoples that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for too long. In the distance, the drums began to beat again, carrying the story of this day across the desert winds. It was a story of courage and honor, of standing up for what was right, even when it cost everything. And it was a story that would be told around Apache fires for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes one person's choice to do what was right could change the world. The stars came out over the Arizona. The stars came out over the Arizona desert, brilliant pinpricks of light in the vast darkness above. Jake Morrison stood alone in the town square, the events of the past 2 days weighing heavily on his mind. The silence was profound now, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind through the mesquite. Behind him, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Coleman emerged, walking slowly across the dusty street. The lawman's face showed the strain of recent events, but there was something else there too. A newfound respect for the man who'd stood up when it mattered most. "Hell of a thing what happened today," Coleman said, joining Jake beneath the oak tree. 500 Apache warriors and not a shot fired. I've never seen anything like it." Jake nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had occurred. "Makes a man think about what really matters, doesn't it? All that anger yesterday, all that hate. And for what? Fear of people we don't even know." "The town's changed," Coleman observed. "You can feel it in the air. People are looking at each other differently, questioning things they never questioned before." As if summoned by their conversation, several townspeople began to emerge from their homes and businesses. Tom Bradley, the banker, approached first, his usual bluster replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility. "Morrison," Bradley said, struggling with the words, what we almost did yesterday was wrong," Jake finished quietly. "But it's what we do next that matters now. Pete Hutchinson appeared from the shadows, his face haggard and drawn. The rancher had aged years in the past day, the weight of his near-catastrophic mistake etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it," Hutchinson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you hadn't stepped in, if we'd gone through with it, Christ, Jake, we would have hanged an innocent man." "But you didn't," Jake replied firmly. "That's what you need to remember. When the truth came out, you listened. That counts for something." More townspeople gathered, drawn by some invisible force to the spot where, just 24 hours earlier, they'd nearly committed an act of irreversible evil. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the town's physician, stood with her medical bag still in hand, having just finished treating the wounded rustlers. "The Apache who warned us about the rustlers," she said thoughtfully. "Ayanna. He could have let us hang for our mistake, let us live with the consequences of our actions. Instead, he chose to help us catch the real criminals. That's the difference between justice and revenge," Jake said. "Justice heals wounds. Revenge just creates new ones." Old Miguel Santos, who ran the town's general store, stepped forward. His weathered hands shook slightly as he spoke. "My grandfather, he used to trade with the Apache before the troubles started. He always said they were people of honor, but I forgot that. We all forgot that." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing the genuine remorse and the desire to make things right. "It's not too late to remember. The bridge that was built today, it's fragile, but it's real. What we do with it is up to us." As the group talked, Jake noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the reservation. Ayanna rode slowly into town, his paint horse's hooves making soft sounds on the packed earth. The young Apache dismounted and walked over to where the townspeople had gathered. "I bring word from my father," Ayanna announced. "He wishes to invite the people of Copper Ridge to a ceremony 3 days hence. It will be a celebration of the bridge that was built today, and a pledge that our peoples will stand together against future troubles." The invitation hung in the air like a prayer, and Jake could see the townspeople struggling with their response. Fear warred with curiosity, prejudice battled with hope. "Will you come?" Ayanna asked, directing the question to Jake, but including everyone in his gaze. "I'll be there," Jake said without hesitation. "It would be an honor." One by one, the other townspeople began to voice their agreement. Some spoke with enthusiasm, others with nervous uncertainty, but all of them recognized the historic nature of the moment. They were being offered a chance to truly know their neighbors, to replace fear with understanding. As the crowd began to disperse, making plans for the upcoming ceremony, Jake found himself walking alongside Ayanna toward the edge of town. The young Apache had become more than just someone Jake had saved. He'd become a friend, a bridge between two worlds. "Your father is a wise man," Jake said as they walked. "This ceremony, it's exactly what both our peoples need. He learned long ago that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it," Ayanna replied. "Today you showed our people that not all white men carry that poison. That is a gift beyond measure." They paused at the town limits, where the desert stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. In the distance, Jake could see the soft glow of fires from the Apache camp, and he wondered what stories were being told around those flames. "The drums have been carrying your story all day," Ayanna said, as if reading his thoughts. "By tomorrow, every Apache in the territory will know the name of Jake Morrison. They will know that when darkness threatened to consume justice, one man stood in its path." Jake felt the weight of that responsibility, but also the honor of it. "I hope I can live up to that reputation." "You already have," Ayanna assured him. "But the story is not finished. Today was just the beginning." As Ayanna rode back toward the reservation, Jake stood alone under the vast Arizona sky, contemplating the events that had transformed his life and his town. The drought continued, the land remained harsh and unforgiving, but something fundamental had changed. Fear had been replaced by understanding, hatred by hope. The next morning brought news that would echo across the territory for years to come. Word spread quickly of the Apache ceremony and of the white cowboy who'd stood up for justice. Other towns began to reach out to their Apache neighbors, tentative at first, but with growing confidence as they saw that peace was possible. Jake Morrison had become something he'd never expected to be, a symbol of what was possible when good people chose to do what was right. His simple act of courage had created ripples that spread far beyond Copper Ridge, touching lives and changing hearts across the desert southwest. The ceremony 3 days later was everything Chief Nalnish had promised and more. For the first time in decades, Apache and white settlers gathered together in peace, sharing food and stories and dreams for the future. Children played together while their parents talked of trade and cooperation, of building a world where both peoples could thrive. As Jake watched the celebration unfold, he thought about the rope that had once hung from the oak tree in Copper Ridge's town square. It had been a symbol of fear and hatred, of the dark impulses that lived in the hearts of frightened people, but it was gone now, replaced by something far more powerful, the bonds of understanding and mutual respect. The desert wind carried the sound of laughter and music across the canyon walls, and Jake knew that he was witnessing the birth of something new. The old ways of fear and violence were giving way to something better, something that honored the best in both peoples. That night, as the ceremony wound down and the stars emerged in all their glory, Jake Morrison stood once again beneath the vast Arizona sky. But this time he was not alone. Beside him stood Ayanna and Chief Nalnish and dozens of others, Apache and white, all united by the simple belief that justice and honor were worth fighting for. The cowboy who had stood between a young Apache and the Noose had become something more than he'd ever imagined. He'd become a bridge builder, a peacemaker, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, one person's courage could light the way toward a better future. And in the years that followed, when the story of that day was told around campfires and in saloons, in Apache villages and frontier towns, people would remember not just the 500 warriors who lined the road in silent honor, but the man who'd earned that honor through a simple act of standing up for what was right. Jake Morrison had learned that true courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about doing what was right, despite the fear. And in doing so, he'd helped write a new chapter in the story of the American West, one where justice and honor could triumph over hatred and fear. The bridge he'd helped build that day would endure for generations, a testament to the power of one person's choice to stand up for what was right. And whenever future generations faced similar choices, they would remember the cowboy who stood between a young Apache and the Noose, and they would know that courage, however small it might seem, could change the world.